Sarah Mitchell adjusted her seatbelt and glanced at her watch. The red-eye flight from Denver to Miami would get her to the medical conference just in time for her presentation on emergency aviation medicine. At 34, she had built a reputation as one of the country's leading flight surgeons. But tonight she was just another passenger trying to catch some sleep on a commercial airline. The Boeing 737 was half empty, which suited Sarah perfectly. She had chosen a window seat in the emergency exit row, partly for the extra legroom and partly out of habit. After 15 years of military service and countless hours in cockpits, she felt more comfortable near the wings where she could observe the aircraft's behavior. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Sarah noticed the flight attendant, Maria, checking emergency equipment with unusual thoroughness. Their eyes met briefly, and Maria offered a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Something seemed off, but Sarah couldn't pinpoint what. Captain James Harrison and First Officer Tom Bradley ran through their final pre-flight checks in the cockpit. Harrison, a veteran with 23 years of commercial flying experience, felt a slight headache coming on but dismissed it as fatigue from his previous flight's delayed arrival. Bradley, newer to the airline but experienced nonetheless, was focused on the weather reports showing some turbulence ahead. The plane lifted off smoothly into the night sky. Sarah watched the city lights fade below as they climbed to cruising altitude. Most passengers had already dozed off or were absorbed in their devices. The cabin was peaceful, with only the steady hum of engines and occasional rustle of someone adjusting their position. About an hour into the flight, Maria approached Sarah's row to collect empty cups. As she leaned over, she whispered, "Excuse me, but I noticed your medical bag in the overhead compartment. Are you a doctor?" Sarah nodded, curious about the question. Maria continued in a low voice, "I have some experience recognizing different types of professionals. Your posture and the way you observe everything tells me you might have aviation background too." Before Sarah could respond fully, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we work through this." The announcement was calm and routine, but Sarah caught something in the captain's voice that made her alert. She had heard that particular tone before, during her military service when pilots were trying to project confidence while dealing with serious problems. Her training kicked in automatically, and she began mentally cataloging everything she observed about the aircraft's behavior, the engine sounds and the crew's movements. The plane suddenly banked slightly to the left, then corrected course. It wasn't dramatic enough to alarm most passengers, but Sarah's experienced eye recognized it as unusual. Commercial flights typically maintained incredibly smooth trajectories unless encountering significant weather or mechanical issues. Maria returned to Sarah's seat, this time with obvious concern on her face. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but could you please come with me to the galley? I need to ask you something important." Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and followed the flight attendant to the rear of the aircraft, where they could speak privately. In the galley, Maria's professional composure cracked slightly. "I've been flying for 12 years, and I've never seen Captain Harrison look the way he did when I checked on the cockpit 10 minutes ago." He was pale and seemed disoriented. When I asked if everything was okay, he just stared at me for several seconds before answering. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Pilot incapacitation could result from various factors: medical emergencies, hypoxia, carbon monoxide poisoning, or even food poisoning. "What about the first officer?" she asked. "That's what really worries me," Maria replied. He wasn't responding normally either. They both seemed sluggish and confused. "I know this sounds dramatic, but I think something might be seriously wrong up there." The aircraft shuddered slightly, and Sarah felt a subtle change in engine pitch that confirmed her growing suspicions. Whatever was happening in the cockpit was beginning to affect the plane's performance. She looked at Maria with the steady gaze that had carried her through countless emergency situations. "I need you to tell me exactly what you observed about both pilots, and I need to know what our options are for communicating with air traffic control independently of the cockpit," Sarah said quietly. "Because if you're right about what you're seeing, we may have a very serious problem that requires immediate action." Maria's hands trembled slightly as she recounted her observations. "When I brought them coffee 30 minutes ago, Captain Harrison was rubbing his temples and seemed to be having trouble focusing on the instruments. First Officer Bradley was slumped in his seat, and when I spoke to him, his response was delayed and slurred. Sarah's medical training immediately suggested several possibilities, but one stood out as most likely given the symptoms affecting both pilots simultaneously. Maria, I need you to think carefully. Did you notice any unusual smells in the cockpit? Anything that seemed different from normal? The flight attendant's eyes widened with recognition. Actually, yes. There was a faint odor, almost sweet but chemical-like. I thought maybe it was cleaning supplies or something from the galley, but it was stronger near the cockpit door. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Sarah had seen it before in military aircraft with faulty environmental systems. The odorless gas could incapacitate pilots gradually, affecting their judgment and motor skills before they even realized what was happening. If her suspicion was correct, both pilots were in immediate danger and the situation would only worsen with time. Listen to me very carefully, Sarah said, keeping her voice calm but urgent. I believe the pilots may be suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning. We need to get to the cockpit immediately to assess their condition, and we need to contact air traffic control. Do you have access to any emergency communication equipment? Maria nodded quickly. There's a satellite phone for emergencies, and I can override the cockpit door lock with the flight attendant access code. But are you qualified to help with something like this? Sarah's response was interrupted by an announcement from the cockpit, but this time Captain Harrison's voice was noticeably different. His words were slower and there was a concerning pause in the middle of his sentence. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some navigation equipment. Please remain seated. The incomplete announcement sent a chill through Sarah. The pilots were deteriorating rapidly, and the aircraft was now at serious risk. She turned to Maria with the authority that had made her one of the youngest commanders in her military unit. I'm a flight surgeon with the Air Force, and I have extensive pilot training on multiple aircraft types, including this one. We're looking at a potential catastrophic situation if we don't act immediately. I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly. Maria straightened her shoulders, drawing on her own professional training. What do you need me to do? First, get that satellite phone and contact air traffic control. Tell them we have a suspected pilot incapacitation emergency and need immediate guidance. Then we're going to the cockpit. I need to assess both pilots and potentially take control of the aircraft. As they moved toward the front of the plane, Sarah mentally reviewed everything she knew about the Boeing 737 systems. It had been 2 years since her last simulation training on this specific aircraft type, but the fundamentals remained the same. More importantly, her experience with emergency situations had taught her that competent action was better than perfect knowledge when lives were at stake. The few passengers who were awake watched with mild curiosity as the flight attendant and the woman from the emergency exit row moved purposefully through the cabin. Sarah was grateful that most people were sleeping and unaware of the developing crisis. Panic among passengers would only complicate an already dangerous situation. Maria unlocked the cockpit door, and Sarah immediately smelled the chemical odor that confirmed her diagnosis. Both pilots were conscious but clearly impaired. Captain Harrison was struggling to read his instruments, while First Officer Bradley appeared to be fighting to stay alert. Captain Harrison, Sarah said in a clear, authoritative voice as she entered the cockpit. I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, flight surgeon with the United States Air Force. You and your first officer are experiencing carbon monoxide poisoning. I need to take immediate control of this aircraft. The captain looked at her with confused eyes, trying to process her words through the fog of poisoning. His training told him that no unauthorized person should be in the cockpit, but his compromised mental state made it difficult to respond appropriately. Sarah didn't wait for permission. She had learned long ago that emergency situations required decisive action, not committees. She moved to the captain's seat and began her assessment of the aircraft's current status while Maria worked frantically with the satellite phone to reach air traffic control. The altimeter showed they were maintaining 35,000 feet, but the heading indicator revealed they had drifted several degrees off course. More concerning was the fact that the autopilot was engaged, but showing warning lights that neither pilot had apparently noticed or been able to address. Miami Center. This is emergency call from Flight 447. Maria spoke into the satellite phone. We have pilot incapacitation and need immediate assistance. The voice that crackled through the satellite phone was professional but urgent. Flight 447, this is Miami Center. Confirm pilot incapacitation. What is your current status and who is speaking? Maria handed the phone to Sarah, who was now seated in the captain's chair while trying to assess the aircraft's systems. Miami Center, this is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I'm a military flight surgeon and pilot taking control of this aircraft due to suspected carbon monoxide poisoning of both crew members. I need immediate guidance and emergency clearance. There was a brief pause before the controller responded. Dr. Mitchell, understand you have pilot training. What is your experience level with commercial aircraft? Sarah quickly scanned the instrument panel while answering. I have military pilot certification with experience on similar Boeing systems. Current altitude 35,000 feet, approximately 200 miles northeast of Miami. Both pilots are conscious but severely impaired. I need immediate medical guidance for treatment and aviation guidance for approach procedures. Captain Harrison tried to speak, but his words were slurred and incomprehensible. First Officer Bradley had slumped forward over his controls, still breathing but barely responsive. Sarah gently moved him back in his seat and turned her attention to the most pressing issue, getting fresh air into the cockpit. Maria, I need you to find the emergency oxygen masks for the cockpit crew and help me get them on both pilots. Then check if there's a way to increase airflow or ventilation in this area. Sarah's voice remained calm, but inside she was running through multiple emergency scenarios simultaneously. The autopilot suddenly disengaged with a sharp warning sound, causing the aircraft to bank slightly to the right. Sarah immediately took manual control of the yoke, feeling the familiar weight and responsiveness of the aircraft. Her muscle memory from countless hours of military flying kicked in, and she smoothly corrected the plane's trajectory. Miami Center. Autopilot has disengaged and I have manual control. Request vectors for emergency approach and medical assistance standing by at destination airport. Sarah's training had taught her to communicate clearly and frequently during emergencies, keeping air traffic control informed of every development. The controller's voice carried new urgency. Flight 447, we're declaring an emergency and clearing all traffic from your approach path. Descent clearance to 10,000 feet. Heading 180. Miami International is preparing emergency medical teams and fire rescue. As Sarah began the descent, she noticed that the aircraft felt different from the military planes she was accustomed to flying. The controls were less responsive, and the size and weight of the commercial airliner required more gentle inputs. However, the fundamental principles remained the same: attitude, altitude, airspeed, and heading. Maria returned with oxygen masks and quickly fitted them over both pilots. The additional oxygen might help counteract some effects of the carbon monoxide poisoning, but Sarah knew that full recovery would take hours or even days depending on the exposure level. Dr. Mitchell, came a new voice over the radio. This is Dr. Patricia Wells, emergency physician at Miami International. Can you describe the pilot's current condition? Sarah glanced at both men while maintaining control of the descent. Both patients show signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. Confusion, disorientation, slurred speech, and decreased motor control. Captain Harrison is more responsive than the first officer, but neither is capable of performing flight duties. They've been on oxygen for about 5 minutes now. Copy that. Continue oxygen therapy and monitor their breathing. We'll have hyperbaric treatment ready upon arrival. How are you feeling? Any symptoms of exposure? The question made Sarah pause and perform a quick self-assessment. She had been in the cockpit for nearly 15 minutes now, breathing the same contaminated air. I'm feeling alert and responsive, but I did notice a slight headache. Could be stress or early exposure symptoms. Understood. Try to minimize your time breathing cockpit air. Is there any way to isolate or improve ventilation in that area? Maria had been working on that exact problem. I found the environmental control panel, she called out. There are settings for cabin pressure and air circulation, but I don't want to touch anything without knowing what it does. Sarah made a quick decision. Take a photo of the current settings with your phone, then try switching the air source to external or increasing circulation. We need to get clean air flowing through here. The aircraft was now passing through 25,000 feet, and Sarah could see the lights of Florida's coastline in the distance. The sight was reassuring, but she knew the most challenging part of the flight was still ahead. Landing a commercial airliner was far more complex than anything she had done in military service, especially under these emergency conditions. Miami Center, I need detailed approach information for runway configuration and landing procedures. This will be my first commercial landing, and I want to ensure passenger safety. The controller's response came immediately. Flight 447, we're setting up for straight-in approach to runway 08L, longest runway available. Emergency vehicles are in position. We'll talk you through every step of the approach and landing sequence. As Sarah continued the descent, she felt the weight of responsibility for the 127 passengers behind her. In military aviation, she had been responsible for expensive aircraft and important missions, but this was different. These were civilians who had trusted the airline to get them safely to their destination, and now their lives depended on her ability to land an aircraft she had never actually flown before. As the aircraft descended through 20,000 feet, Sarah felt a growing sense of focus that she recognized from her military training. The external pressure and complexity of the situation seemed to sharpen her awareness rather than overwhelm her. Every instrument reading, every subtle change in engine sound, every radio transmission became crystal clear in her mind. Flight 447, this is Commander Jake Morrison, retired Navy pilot now working as emergency consultant for Miami Center. Dr. Mitchell, I understand you have military flight experience. What aircraft types are you certified on? The new voice on the radio carried an authority and understanding that immediately put Sarah at ease. Commander Morrison, I'm certified on T-6 Texan, T-38 Talon, and C-130 Hercules, with extensive simulator time on Boeing systems during flight surgeon training. My most recent flying was 6 months ago. Outstanding. That's solid experience. The 737 will feel different, but the principles are identical. I'm going to walk you through the approach configuration and landing procedures step by step. First, let's talk about your current power settings and descent rate. Sarah scanned the instruments and reported her readings. The aircraft was stable and responding well to her inputs, but she could feel the difference in weight and momentum compared to military aircraft. Every control movement had to be more deliberate and patient. Meanwhile, Maria had successfully adjusted the environmental controls, and fresh air was now flowing into the cockpit. Captain Harrison's condition seemed to be stabilizing somewhat, though he remained confused and unable to assist. First Officer Bradley was still largely unresponsive despite the oxygen therapy. Dr. Mitchell, came Dr. Wells' voice again. We need to discuss the possibility that you might also be affected by carbon monoxide exposure. Are you experiencing any vision changes, dizziness, or difficulty concentrating? Sarah performed another self-assessment while maintaining her scan of the flight instruments. Her headache had intensified slightly, and she noticed that she had to focus more deliberately on reading some of the smaller instrument displays. I'm experiencing mild headache and possibly some visual fatigue, but my thinking feels clear and my motor control is normal. That's consistent with low-level exposure. The good news is that you're getting fresh air now and your symptoms shouldn't worsen. However, we need to be prepared for the possibility that your condition could deteriorate during the approach phase. The reality of Dr. Wells's warning hit Sarah with full force. If her symptoms worsened during the critical landing phase, all 127 passengers could be in serious danger. She pushed the thought aside and focused on the immediate task of flying the aircraft safely. Flight 447, descend and maintain 15,000 feet, came the instruction from air traffic control. We're sequencing you for straight-in approach. Current weather conditions are favorable with light winds from the southeast. As Sarah continued the descent, she became aware of movement in the cabin behind her. Some passengers had noticed the change in flight pattern and the longer than usual time since the last captain's announcement. Maria had been monitoring the cabin situation while assisting in the cockpit. I think we need to make an announcement to the passengers, Maria suggested quietly. A few people are starting to ask questions, and I'd rather they hear something official than start imagining worst-case scenarios. Sarah nodded, realizing that passenger management was another critical element she needed to consider. What do you recommend we tell them? Something simple and reassuring. Medical emergency with the crew. Qualified backup pilot in control. Emergency landing as a precaution. The truth but not the full truth. Commander Morrison's voice crackled over the radio again. Dr. Mitchell, let's start configuring for approach. At 10,000 feet, I want you to reduce speed to 250 knots and extend the flaps to position 1. I'll guide you through each configuration change. Sarah acknowledged the instruction and began following Morrison's guidance. Each step felt manageable individually, but the cumulative complexity was building. She had to monitor airspeed, altitude, heading, and dozens of other parameters while communicating with multiple people and fighting off the effects of carbon monoxide exposure. The lights of Miami International Airport became visible in the distance, a reassuring beacon in the darkness. Sarah could see the approach lights for runway 08L extending into the ocean, creating a perfect pathway for her landing. The sight triggered memories of countless military approaches, and she felt her confidence building. "Maria, can you make that announcement now?" Sarah requested. "I need to focus entirely on the approach procedures for the next 30 minutes. Maria picked up the cabin microphone with steady hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant. We are beginning our descent into Miami International Airport. Due to a medical situation with our flight crew, we have a qualified military pilot assisting with our landing. This is purely a precautionary measure, and we expect a normal arrival. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and your seats are in the upright position." The announcement was met with murmurs and some concerned voices from the cabin, but Sarah was impressed with how calmly Maria had delivered the information. Most passengers seemed to accept the explanation and were preparing for landing without panic. Flight 447, descend to 8,000 feet, and reduce speed to 210 knots. "You're doing excellent work up there." Commander Morrison's encouraging voice provided exactly the confidence boost Sarah needed as she approached the most challenging phase of the emergency. At 8,000 feet, the runway lights of Miami International Airport stretched out clearly before them. Sarah could see the emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, their red and blue lights creating a dramatic scene that reminded her of military emergency exercises, except this time it was devastatingly real. "Flight 447, you're cleared for straight-in approach runway. 8L, contact tower on. 119.1 for landing clearance," came the instruction from approach control. Sarah switched radio frequencies and immediately heard the tower controller's voice. "Flight 447 Miami Tower, we have emergency equipment standing by. Continue approach, report the runway in sight." "Tower, Flight 447, runway in sight. Continuing approach," Sarah responded, surprised at how calm her own voice sounded despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Commander Morrison continued his guidance over the emergency frequency. "Dr. Mitchell, at 6,000 feet extend flaps to position 5 and lower the landing gear. You'll hear several warning sounds, but that's normal. The aircraft will feel different with the gear extended, so be prepared for that change." Sarah followed the instructions precisely, and the aircraft's behavior changed dramatically as the landing gear extended and locked into position. The increased drag and altered center of gravity required immediate adjustments to power and attitude. Her military training had prepared her for this type of configuration change, but the 737's response was more sluggish than she expected. "Gear down and locked, flaps at position 5, she reported. "Aircraft feels stable but heavier than expected." "That's normal for commercial aircraft," Morrison reassured her. "You're doing everything correctly. At 4,000 feet, extend flaps to position 15 and adjust your approach speed to 145 knots. As Sarah made the next configuration change, she noticed that Captain Harrison was becoming more alert. The oxygen therapy and fresh air circulation were gradually reducing his carbon monoxide levels, though he was still far from being capable of resuming control. "Sarah," he said weakly, using her first name instead of the formal address he had maintained earlier. "I can see what you're doing. You're flying this better than most commercial pilots on their first approach." The unexpected compliment from the experienced captain provided a surge of confidence, but Sarah remained focused on the approach. She was now at 3,000 feet and could clearly see the approach lights leading to the runway threshold. Maria had been monitoring both pilots' conditions while keeping an eye on the cabin situation. "Dr. Mitchell, the passengers are remarkably calm. I think your professional handling of the situation is giving everyone confidence. Flight 447, you're on a perfect approach path," the tower controller announced. "Wind calm, visibility unlimited. You're cleared to land runway 08L. Commander Morrison's voice came through with final approach guidance. "Dr. Mitchell, extend flaps to full position 40 and maintain 140 knots until you cross the runway threshold. Remember, this aircraft will want to float more than military planes, so be patient with the touchdown." At 1,000 feet above the ground, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of transitioning from flying an aircraft to landing it. The runway grew larger in her windscreen, and she could see the emergency vehicles positioned along the sides of the runway, The moment reminded her of countless military landings, but never before had the stakes felt so personal. 500 feet, she called out, following commercial aviation procedures. Airspeed 140 on centerline, rate of descent 700 feet per minute. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold perfectly aligned with the centerline. Sarah gradually reduced power and began the landing flare, raising the aircraft's nose slightly to bleed off airspeed and prepare for touchdown. The timing had to be perfect. Too early and the aircraft would balloon back into the air. Too late and they would hit the runway hard. Beautiful approach. Commander Morrison's voice carried genuine admiration. Hold that attitude and let it settle. The main landing gear touched the runway with barely a bump, followed seconds later by the nose gear. Sarah immediately applied reverse thrust and wheel brakes, feeling the massive aircraft slow from 130 knots to taxi speed in what seemed like an impossibly short distance. Flight 447, excellent landing. Turn right on taxiway Alpha 7 and follow the emergency vehicles to the gate, the tower controller instructed. As Sarah turned off the runway, she felt a wave of relief and exhaustion wash over her. The emergency was over, and all 127 passengers were safely on the ground. She had successfully landed a commercial airliner under emergency conditions while fighting off the effects of carbon monoxide poisoning. Outstanding work. Dr. Mitchell, came Commander Morrison's final transmission. That was one of the finest emergency landings I've ever witnessed. You should be extremely proud of what you accomplished tonight. Maria was already coordinating with the medical teams that were boarding the aircraft to treat both pilots. Captain Harrison managed a weak smile and said, "Thank you, Commander Mitchell. You saved a lot of lives tonight." The title surprised Sarah. In all the excitement and focus required for the emergency landing, she had forgotten that her military rank was commander, not doctor in this context. For the past 2 hours, she had been Dr. Mitchell, the flight surgeon, but in successfully taking command of a crisis situation and bringing 127 people safely home, she had truly earned the title of commander. The aircraft came to a complete stop at the designated emergency gate, where medical teams and federal aviation investigators were already waiting. Sarah completed the engine shutdown procedures with guidance from the checklist, ensuring that all systems were properly secured before leaving the cockpit. As the cabin door opened, medical personnel immediately boarded to assess both pilots. Captain Harrison was conscious and talking, though still showing signs of carbon monoxide exposure. First Officer Bradley required assistance walking off the aircraft and was quickly transported to the hospital for hyperbaric oxygen treatment. Dr. Wells approached Sarah as she emerged from the cockpit. "Commander Mitchell, we need to evaluate you as well. You've been exposed to carbon monoxide for over 2 hours, and while you performed magnificently, we need to ensure you receive proper treatment." Sarah nodded, suddenly feeling the full weight of exhaustion and the lingering effects of the poisoning. Her headache had intensified, and she was experiencing some dizziness now that the adrenaline was subsiding. "I understand. I'd like to make sure both pilots receive priority treatment, though. They're already being taken care of," Dr. Wells assured her. "Captain Harrison will likely recover fully with standard oxygen therapy, but First Officer Bradley may need more intensive treatment. Thanks to your quick recognition of the symptoms and immediate action, both men should make complete recoveries." As Sarah was escorted to the medical facility, she was surprised to see crowds of passengers waiting in the terminal. Many approached her with expressions of gratitude and amazement. An elderly woman named Mrs. Chen grasped her hand and said, "My granddaughter was supposed to meet me tonight. Because of you, I get to see her graduate from college next week." A businessman named Robert Martinez shook her hand firmly. "I've been flying for 30 years and I've never experienced anything like that. The way you handled everything was incredible. You made us all feel safe even in an emergency situation." The emotional weight of what had happened began to settle on Sarah as she realized how many lives had been affected by the night's events. These weren't just statistics or mission parameters. They were real people with families, dreams, and futures that had been preserved because of her actions. Federal Aviation Administration investigator Jennifer Torres approached Sarah at the medical facility. "Commander Mitchell will need to conduct a full debriefing once you've received medical clearance. But I wanted you to know that preliminary investigation suggests a faulty environmental system seal that allowed exhaust gases to contaminate the cockpit air supply. How long might the pilots have been affected?" Sarah asked, concerned about the timeline of their exposure, possibly from shortly after takeoff. The carbon monoxide levels would have built up gradually, which explains why they were able to maintain basic flight operations initially, but became increasingly impaired over time. Your intervention likely prevented a catastrophic accident. The medical evaluation revealed that Sarah had moderate carbon monoxide exposure but was responding well to oxygen therapy. Dr. Wells recommended overnight observation, but Sarah was expected to make a full recovery without any lasting effects. Commander Morrison arrived at the hospital several hours later to meet Sarah in person. The retired Navy pilot was impressed not only with her flying skills, but with her decision-making under extreme pressure. "What you did tonight represents the best of military aviation training applied to civilian crisis management," he told her. "I keep thinking about how differently this could have ended," Sarah reflected. "If Maria hadn't been observant enough to notice the pilot's condition, or if I hadn't been on that particular flight." "But you were there," Morrison replied. "And you made the right decisions at every critical moment. That's not luck. That's training, judgment, and courage working together." News of the emergency landing had spread quickly through aviation and military communities. Sarah's phone contained dozens of messages from former colleagues, superiors, and friends, expressing their admiration and congratulations. The story had also reached national news outlets, with headlines praising the military doctor who became an airline captain. Captain Harrison was released from the hospital the following morning and specifically requested to speak with Sarah before she left Miami. "I've been flying commercially for over 20 years, he told her, "and I've always wondered what I would do in a situation where I couldn't perform my duties. Knowing that there are people like you out there who can step up when needed gives me tremendous comfort." "You would have done the same thing in my position," Sarah replied. "We're all trained to handle emergencies. I just happened to be the right person in the right place at the right time." But even as she said the words, Sarah knew that the night had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had always been confident in her medical abilities and proud of her military service, but successfully commanding a commercial aircraft under emergency conditions had revealed capabilities she didn't know she possessed. The experience had also shown her how much she missed the immediate, tangible impact of saving lives that had defined her military career. Her current work in aviation medicine was important, but it felt abstract compared to the direct responsibility she had felt for those 127 passengers. 6 months after the emergency landing, Sarah stood in the office of the Director of Emergency Response for the Federal Aviation Administration. The meeting had been scheduled to discuss her official recognition for the incident, but the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. Commander Mitchell, Director Patricia Reynolds said, "We've been developing a new program for emergency aviation response, and your experience that night in Miami has convinced us that you're exactly the person we need to lead it." The program, Reynolds explained, would train medical professionals with aviation backgrounds to serve as emergency consultants for situations involving pilot incapacitation. Sarah would help develop protocols, train other potential emergency pilots, and serve as a liaison between medical and aviation authorities during crises. "It's essentially creating a specialized role that didn't exist before your flight," Reynolds continued. "We realize that having someone with both medical expertise and pilot training available for consultation could save lives in similar situations across the country." Sarah was intrigued but surprised. "I never imagined that one emergency would lead to changing aviation policy. Are situations like this common enough to justify a specialized program?" "More common than most people realize," Reynolds replied. "Pilot medical emergencies occur several times per year, and we currently rely on finding qualified passengers or talking inexperienced people through emergency procedures. Your background combination is rare, but we believe we can identify and train others with similar qualifications." The position would allow Sarah to continue her medical practice while contributing to aviation safety in a completely new way. It felt like the perfect synthesis of her military experience, medical training, and the confidence she had gained during the emergency landing. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a call that would test her new role. A United Airlines flight from Seattle to Boston was reporting an emergency. The captain had suffered an apparent heart attack, and the first officer was a recent graduate with limited experience in severe weather conditions approaching the East Coast. This time, Sarah was prepared. Working from the FAA's Emergency Coordination Center, she was able to provide medical guidance for treating the captain while simultaneously consulting with air traffic control about approach options for the inexperienced first officer. The flight landed safely in Philadelphia with no injuries. The success of that second emergency convinced Sarah that she had found her true calling. Over the following months, she consulted on 4 more aviation medical emergencies, each one reinforcing her belief that the combination of medical and aviation expertise could save lives in unique ways. A year after the Miami incident, Sarah was invited to speak at the International Aviation Safety Conference. Her presentation, titled "When Passengers Become Pilots: Medical Aviation Emergency Response," was attended by airline executives, government officials, and aviation safety experts from around the world. The night I was called commander by passengers who had never seen me in uniform taught me that leadership isn't about titles or official positions, she told the audience. It's about being prepared to act when circumstances demand it, and having the training and confidence to make critical decisions under pressure. Several airlines began incorporating Sarah's protocols into their emergency procedures, and aviation medical schools started offering specialized training for flight surgeons interested in emergency pilot certification. The program she had helped develop was being adopted internationally. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Maria, the flight attendant who had first noticed the pilot's condition, had been accepted into medical school and planned to specialize in emergency medicine. That night showed me how medical knowledge can be applied in completely unexpected situations. Maria wrote in a letter to Sarah, "Watching you take command and save everyone's lives inspired me to pursue medicine so I could help people the way you did." Captain Harrison had also made a career change, becoming an instructor pilot focused on training crews for emergency situations. "I learned that recognizing when you can't safely perform your duties is just as important as being able to perform them," he told Sarah during a chance meeting at an aviation conference. First Officer Bradley had made a full recovery and returned to flying, but he had also become an advocate for improved cockpit air quality monitoring systems. His experience had led to new regulations requiring carbon monoxide detectors in all commercial aircraft. The most profound change, however, was in Sarah herself. The emergency had revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, and had shown her a path that combined all of her skills and experiences in meaningful ways. She continued practicing aviation medicine, but now her work had expanded to include emergency response training, protocol development, and consultation on aviation safety improvements. On quiet evenings, Sarah sometimes reflected on how a routine, red-eye flight had changed not only her life, but potentially the lives of countless future passengers who would benefit from the safety improvements that had resulted from that night. She had boarded the plane as Dr. Sarah Mitchell, flight surgeon, but had emerged as Commander Mitchell, emergency aviation specialist, and pioneer of a new field that bridged medicine and aviation safety. The experience had taught her that sometimes the most important moments in life come without warning, and that being prepared to step up when others need you most is one of the greatest services anyone can provide. She had learned that true leadership isn't about seeking authority, but about accepting responsibility when circumstances demand it. Most importantly, she had discovered that the combination of medical knowledge, aviation skills, and the courage to act could literally mean the difference between life and death for people who were counting on her competence and judgment. It was a responsibility she carried with pride and dedication, knowing that somewhere in the sky, another passenger might one day need exactly the skills and experience she had gained that transformative night over the Atlantic.